Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth webinar of our webinar series on expanding the scope of research in planetary health in Europe. I am Jaana Halonen. I'm Research Program Director at Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare, THL, and I'm hosting this session with Mark Nieuwenhuisen, who is Research Professor, Director of the Urban Planning, Environment and Health Initiative, and Director of the Air Pollution and Urban Environment Program at ISGlobal. This webinar series is part of the Severo Ochoa strategic program at ISGlobal. And this is a result of the strong collaboration between THL, ISGlobal, and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, from where we have responsible colleagues, Alan Dangour, who is Professor and Director of the Center of Climate Change and Planetary Health, as well as Sir Andy Haynes, Professor of Environmental Change and Public Health. As a brief background for this webinar series, we held a conference, Europe that Protects, Safeguarding Our Planet, Safeguarding Our Health in Helsinki in December 2019. That was held during the presidency of Finland, presidency of the EU in Finland. In that conference, researchers, policymakers, and regulators presented and discussed issues on planetary health and how to deploy this approach in Europe. There we agreed that there is a need for strengthening the research networks in planetary health within Europe. Another activity behind this initiative, this webinar series, is the Horizon 2020 funded work on research agenda for the environment, climate and health 2020 to 2030, which is the HERA project. And there a large consortium has identified research gaps in this field. So based on the presentations and discussions in these webinars, we aim to develop an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research and innovation agenda for planetary health in Europe. During the previous 3 weeks, we have had 3 webinars already, and those recordings can be found online. Today, we continue with the topic of promoting health through sustainable urban development. And next week, we will end this series by looking forward under the topic catalyzing demand for planetary health in Europe. But now I will let Mark introduce today's program.
Many thanks, Jaana. Hello, it's Mark. As you just heard, we'll be talking about how we can promote health through sustainable urban development. Cities are part of the planetary health agenda. It's a very important factor. And here we'll be exploring a number of factors. Next slide, please. We've brought together a number of very important and speakers. I think that will bring out some of the issues in terms of research, but also in terms of policy, how to make an impact. I think this is very important as well, as we already know quite a lot how we should do further urban development in a healthy way. But unfortunately, implementation is not always so easy. So we start off with James Woodcock from the University of Cambridge. We'll talk a bit more about the research, followed by Maya Negev from the University of Haifa, talking in particular in the issues in drier climate, followed by Matthew Baldwin, who is a bit earlier than we were hoping, but he needs to leave later, who will talk about from a policy perspective from the European Commission, where a lot of the activities are taking place at the moment in terms of implementation. This is followed by Sarah Maya, who talks about nature-based solutions, how they can actually contribute. And at the end, we have Maria Jose Rojo from the Polis Network talking about stakeholders, in particular in relation to transport. After this follows a short panel discussion. If you have any questions, please send them to us during the talks or afterwards, and we'll take them from there. So we would, just to let you know that the webinar is recorded. You can see it back in the future. Your microphones are deactivated. And also the raised hand and chat will not be attended. So if you have any questions, please submit through the question and answer buttons. And also don't forget to indicate if it's the questions addressed to a specific person to whom you want to address it. Okay, so let's go. We've got our first speaker, who is James Woodcock from University of Cambridge. James published substantially on the topic, some really nice publications around urban and transport planning and health, taken into account also the sustainability issues. So he will give us a review of the current status and also show some gaps for the future research that should be addressed. James, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Let's try and do the screen sharing and see if this works.
We can see your slides at the moment, although they're not in presentation mode. Now we've got
presentation mode. Yes.
Yes, great. Thanks,
Brilliant.
James.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Shannon. Thanks for the opportunity to talk today. So I slightly cut my title down, make it a bit more bite-sized to research and action for carbon neutral urban transport in Europe. And I'm James Woodcock, reader in transport and health modelling, the Centre for Diet and Activity Research, part of the MRC Epidemiology Unit at the University of Cambridge. So, transport, on track in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? Well, I think we probably all realise the answer is no. Transport is not meeting greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. And one of the big factors is that the distance driven, if we're talking about road transport, has been increasing and is expected to continue increasing. And when we think about transport, we have to, of course, also think about aviation. Aviation is expected to continue to increase. We need to do something about that. But even with modest increases, or even with holding it stable, it's going to mean that we don't really have any leeway. So when talking about achieving net zero emissions in road transport and surface transport, we really need to be talking about actually hitting zero, not net zero with some leeway. This is just some figures from the UK. What's been happening, if you look at the historical data, this is probably accounting for the pandemic, but you see there has been really only small improvements since 1990. And then when you look at our Department for Transport policy projections, yeah, sure, emissions are projected to fall, but I mean, this is running through to 2050, and they are nothing like falling at the fast enough rate. You see the very different curve that will be needed to hit zero emissions by 2050. Looking at the EU 27, in fact, emissions have got worse. They've increased since 1990, and this is over a shorter timescale. This is projected forward only to about 2036. But you see that with the existing measures in place, there is no net improvement over a very small one, and even with the additional measures that are currently in the pipeline, we see an improvement, but not one at the rate that is necessary. However, we are in important times there, and we are now talking about the end game for the internal combustion engine. This is actually a picture of an electric car. Maybe this is a kind of different route that could have been taken for the last over 100 years. But the UK has now announced an end date for sales of new petrol and diesel, full petrol and diesel of 2030, and of hybrids by 2035. However, this is occurring in a kind of contradictory mindset from the department, because they've also not raised fuel tax for the last 11 years. The EU Commission is going to be setting some new standards on CO2 for new cars in June, I understand. But in both cases, there's no date set for the end of use. It's all very well to have an end date for sales, but we do actually need to think about phasing them out from the stock, vehicle stock as well. And probably what's going to happen here is we're going to have leadership from city regions. Like in London, we have the ultra low emission zones. These kind of things could be or are likely to be extended and tightened, and we're likely to see the city regions restricting non-hybrids and non-full electric cars over the next few years. Now, one of the things, of course, that's coming up is hybrids, and we need to be careful here. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of variation in what's meant by hybrids, plugged-in, mild hybrids, etc., with quite different implications. Also, of course, larger vehicles, and this has been part of the problem of the last decade. So we've seen big growth in SUVs with higher emissions. Larger vehicles can offset benefits, and this was from a study done by Which in UK. The BMW, a large SUV hybrid, was 3 times worse in their tests than in the official tests in terms of miles per gallon. Another contradiction we see is in terms of the road building programme. Here I'm just speaking to the UK, but around 27 billion, 30 billion euros nearly of investment is planned for the strategic road network between 2020 and 2025. And a report by Transport for Quality of Life found that 80% of the CO2 savings projected from cleaner cars over this period would be negated by the road building through construction, the construction of the infrastructure, through faster speeds, and through induced demands, both more traffic, but also more car-based, more development that would be increased with all these new road buildings. It's also important thinking about the kind of electrification to think, well, to what extent is it going to help us tackle the wider health implications of transport? And here we're usually thinking about air pollution, of course, noise pollution, traffic injuries, physical activity or inactivity, but also, of course, we see very clearly in this kind of picture the kind of community severance and the implications that can have. Thinking first about air pollution, already in the UK, over half of PM2.5 comes from brake and tyre wear and resuspension. And electric or zero tailpipe vehicles are only going to partly solve this. If we talk about brake wear, yeah, okay, regenerative braking, low emission discs and pads, particle collections. There are methods there to tackle this. But when we talk about the tyre and the road wear and the resuspension, well, greater weight, potentially with large batteries, may if anything make this worse. So we're certainly not moving to zero tailpipe emissions. Is not going to be moving to zero particulate emissions anytime soon. Noise, often not given the consideration it should have. WHO thinks road traffic noise to ischemic heart disease, potentially also to stroke, to obesity, to diabetes. And when people have looked at the disease burden of noise from traffic noise, it's often similar to that from traffic-related air pollution. And studies in Madrid, in Houston, and Warsaw have all found substantial and quite harms from noise pollution on a similar scale to those from air pollution. And when we look at electric vehicles, well, okay, they don't have to have the same kinds of engine noises, though they're legally required to create some, but they're not removing the road surface contact, which is the majority of the sources of noise in many situations. Physical activity, where I've done a lot of my work, and of course electric vehicles do nothing to improve the situation here, and autonomous vehicles may of course make it worse if they make driving more convenient for all trips. And something we've been working on, looking at the dose-response relationship between physical activity and health outcomes. This is measured in marginal Met hours per week in terms of the exposure, but to put it in terms of walking, you would see that about 2 hours of walking would lead to over a 20% reduction in the risk of premature mortality compared to a sedentary person, and 3 hours of cycling per week, because of the non-linear relationship, would lead to probably over 30% reduction in the risk of premature mortality compared to a sedentary person. So these are very big reductions in the risk of premature mortality, and of course we also see it working through many individual diseases and the morbidity that they come with them. So we've looked at the potential for active travel in England and Wales, and looked at this through a variety of tools that we've created, the propensity to cycle tool, which you see an image from there, but also the kind of smaller kind of sibling of the propensity to cycle tool, the impacts of cycling tool. And when we ran some scenarios through that, if everyone in England was as likely to cycle a trip as existing cyclists, who of course only cycle some of their trips, most of them do at any rate, then we could see around a 10% reduction in all-cause mortality. It's very, very substantial impacts. And this would also reduce car distance by about 9% on a conventional bike scenario, and by about 13% on an e-bike scenario. Now, I would say that these are very substantial, and this shows that even with current trip distances, the current trip patterns as they are, which is what we looked at in this tool, there's the potential for very substantial mode shift. But if we're talking about the move to zero emissions, we need to be thinking more about other ways to reduce car ownership. We can't. What I would say is that electrification and promotion of active travel, yes, both very much so, but we do also need to be specifically talking about tackling car ownership and use in terms of shorter travel distances, lower ownership, and a move to smaller, lighter vehicles. And I would say that the mechanisms through which we do this, and there's a lot of evidence on different kinds of policies, and we're talking about density, the densification, population density. We're talking about reducing the distances that people have to travel to reach different kinds of destinations, which is partly achieved through increases in diversity, mixed land use to provide employment, as well as shops and services near to where people live. The desirability in terms of kind of attractive locations where people want to walk and cycle, where it seems a pleasant option compared to getting in the car. The design, particularly thinking around segregated, protected cycling infrastructure, where you don't have it, pavements and sidewalks that people feel safe on. Pricing, it's got to be also part of the solution, and particularly as the move to electric vehicles, it will mean that fuel-based taxes will no longer be relevant. So we've got to have new ways of charging driving. And parking, we have to remove parking, both because it's a disincentive, but also because it's the only way to free up the space that we need for protected cycle tracks, for making environments nicer in other ways. Public transport, of course, for longer trips. And I think moving away from the model of people own their one or their two cars in their household, thinking about vehicle sharing, which can also not just reduce use and the number of vehicles, but also can help to think about what's a suitable vehicle, and that for kind of doing the perhaps the trips in town, people don't need the kind of vehicle that would be able to drive them, many hundreds of miles. Okay, moving on. Of course, in the last year, people have become much more focused, thinking about their local environments, about the quality that they have, and people are far more concerned about what is happening to them locally and what the implications of this are. And just looking at the time, one set of things that ideas that has come forward has been around the 15-minute city, how we can have destinations, jobs, including perhaps work hubs, so that people from different offices can work in the same shared kind of co-working space within 15 minutes. And these ideas have become, I think, a lot more attractive to people as they start to think about what the quality is of their local environments. At the same time, people are also thinking a lot about the greenery, the greening of their local environments. And we know that green design can help health and well-being, and it can also help in terms of thinking about issues around climate change adaptation, flood protection, reducing the heat island, mitigating pollution noise. And of course, these things can also make it easier and more pleasant to exercise. But we know that access is limited and unequally distributed. So it's important these kind of urban guerrilla effects. So we've seen these small pop-up gardens, these small parklets that have appeared. Just getting towards to finish, as I know I'm running out of time. One important thing that we've seen happening in England in the policy sphere recently has been around the low traffic neighbourhoods. And I would say these are very similar in many ways to what's happening with the super blocks in Barcelona. And evaluation of these is ongoing, but there have been some studies based on some ones that were introduced before the COVID period in London, and found some very substantial benefits, with notable reductions in car ownership over 3 years, which I think is really quite important. Large increases in physical activity, mainly from walking, but also to an extent from cycling. More reductions in car use, substantial reductions, and also around a 3/4 reduction in traffic collisions, reductions in crime, and allaying some of the concerns, no increase in emergency vehicle response time. So just finally on to a few points about where I think the research needs to be going from here. We have to think small cities at the same starting point, and it's easy to come up with kind of general comments about kind of density, but we need to think what are the biggest priorities with different urban forms. Not everywhere starting from the same place, and not needs to go in exactly the same things to start with. And we need to continue to work on the spatial scale. What are the relevant spatial scales for thinking about the exposures, the behaviours, the outcomes? What level of environment is it that determines our behaviours, and how does that work for different segments of the population? Again, not all people are the same. We also need to have more agile assessment. How can we quickly do some of these evaluations of new interventions, new schemes that are happening? And we also need to think here about the new data, new technologies around wearables, computer vision, and so on. And I think this is both a political question, but it's also a research question about how to build winning coalitions in terms of thinking about trade-offs, unintended consequences, justice implications, and overcoming vested interests. And we're looking at this in a couple of projects that I'm doing, but I've got to finish there, I think. So I'll just say thank you.
Thank you so much, James. That is a wonderful introduction to the topic and some very important issues. I think we're going to take the questions in the panel discussion later on because we want to stay on time. So I'm going to hand over to Jana, who's going to introduce our next speaker. Thanks so much. And we'll see you back soon, James.
Yes, thank you. And the next speaker will be Maya Negev from University of Ochoa, and she will talk about promoting health through sustainable urban development in hotter and drier climate, and what are the barriers and facilitators there. So please go ahead, Maya.
Thank you, Jana. I would like to start with a story. Back in 1902, Howard suggested the garden city concept. Back then, he recognized the health benefits of green spaces well before we had so much environmental epidemiology evidence. He designed cities with housing clusters surrounded by gardens. This concept was adopted to the city of Beersheba, which was newly designed in 1950 in the desert of Israel. However, due to water shortage and hot temperatures, the result is rather poor, and until today, there are quite a lot of dry, empty plots in the middle of town, which is quite segregated. Today, I'm going to ask how can we take the concepts of healthy cities and adapt them to hotter, drier climates such as in the Mediterranean. I will present the dual challenge of heat and dryness, discuss the social context, so some current urban design problems, and suggest facilitators for healthy dry cities. The Mediterranean is a climate hotspot with mean temperatures already way above baseline at about 1.5 degrees. This trend is expected to intensify according to most IPCC scenarios, alongside a decrease in precipitation in the Mediterranean region. Water shortage may present the new tragedy of the commons even in greener, all year wetter places such as the UK. In the Mediterranean, we already have scarcity of green and blue spaces, which, as we all know, are associated with increased physical activity, contributes to mental health and to many dimensions of physical health. Heat puts a lot of limits on healthy lifestyle. It prevents active travel. It limits outdoor physical activity and social cohesion, and is associated with numerous illnesses as well as with aggressiveness and violence. This is a typical image of a park in Israel. It's the Jaffa Park near Tel Aviv, which was designed as a green space, but on a normal summer day with 35, 40 degrees Celsius, you cannot see many people walking around or kids playing around because it is so hot. And most of the scarce trees are palm trees, which do not provide much shade, and we can see that the one person in the park is using this shade. We have a similar problem with usage of public transport. Here are examples from several cities in the Mediterranean and also in the UK, where there is no shade in public transport stops. This prevents people who are more affluent from using public transport, and also exposes those who use it to heat stress. And whoever is from the Mediterranean know that sometimes you can wait quite a long time for a bus to arrive, so it can be a great hazard. In addition, in many countries in Europe, about a quarter of the people suffer from energy poverty in the sense that they are not able to comfortably cool their house during the summer. aging, gender, and occupational health, those who work outside, such as in construction or other outdoor occupations, are all more exposed. Here we present in green some of the characteristics of healthy cities, and in yellow some of the main challenges. So we can see that for most of the characteristics of healthy cities, there are particular challenges in dry cities in providing clean air, clean water, comfortable temperatures, housing, and transportation that are conveniently used, and of course, green and blue spaces. In the next few slides, I'm going to suggest that urban design can help solve these issues. So first of all, as you can see here, for example, lighter surfaces, greenery, and shade can reduce solar radiation and increase the flow of cooler air. This example provided by Professor L shows an experiment in a desert city in Israel, which shows the thermal stress. It's a combination of temperature and humidity, which is outdoors very hot during much of the day. But when we add exposed grass without shading, we already have better thermal conditions, which are characterized as warm. When shade was added, the thermal stress was significantly reduced. And when shade, either artificial or vegetation, when shade was added to grass, we achieve thermal comfort throughout the day. It's interesting that trees and fabric shade held almost an identical effects on thermal mass, and it is important for us where we have water shortage that we can provide shade and thermal comfort also in artificial ways. In this illustration, we present some of the characteristics of hot and dry cities in the top and bottom lines, and of course the urban heat island in red. And then we propose some urban design tools. It's like a toolbox at the city, street, and human scale to mitigate these harsh conditions and achieve thermal comfort and provide for healthy lifestyle. So in the few slides, in the time that I have left, I'm going to go into some of these details. First of all, it's important to remember that the healthy city strategies, which are on the left column here, are relevant also for hot and dry cities. It's just that we need to adapt them in order to provide for healthy conditions, healthy lifestyle conditions. For example, we want to increase the density and land use diversity, and we also want to emphasize short walking distances, shading, and consider seasonal rain patterns. So here we can see the issue of shaded active transport paths with an example from Tel Aviv, which this avenue is widely used for cycling and for walking and in quite comfortable temperatures throughout the day. Top left, we can see it's a thermal illustration of how different types of vegetation provide different temperatures, and it's very important to know which trees to plant and how to design the shading. Top left is an example of xeriscape, desert landscaping. In areas where we cannot provide as many green and blue spaces as we would have wanted, it's an interesting research question to see whether we can provide or achieve the same or similar health benefits with yellow spaces which are designed well. So in hot and dry cities, we cannot cool the whole area, but we can create comfortable microclimates. And here we have an example of shading that is both artificial and vegetation. We emphasize tree canopies to achieve thermal comfort and well-being. And in cities, we can design the buildings and the streets also to achieve breeze, and natural ventilation. Finally, at the building level, green building can enhance a lot of health benefits. For example, well-insulated buildings with high thermal mass can keep buildings cooler in summer and hotter in winter without a lot of energy demand. High reflectance roofs are also important to reduce indoor temperature, but it is important to remember that in hot and dry climates, the reason is not usually green roofs, which are water demanding and require high maintenance, and therefore using light colors can achieve similar benefits. Passive cooling is another important tool. This is the City Hall of Jerusalem. I grew up near it and I crossed it almost every day, and it's not a pleasant experience during summer on the way back from school. But even large public squares can be shaded, and here is an example of a suggestion to add artificial shading that reduces the temperature in the public square. Finally, in my talk, I gave some examples mainly from Israel, but the Mediterranean at large, including most of Southern Europe, is going to get hotter and drier in the next few decades. Therefore, these questions are relevant for all of us. Some questions are how to adapt green and blue nature-based solutions to dry landscapes, to yellow landscapes, how to design research to collect more evidence on the health benefits of such adaptation. And in order to answer these research questions, I suggest that we should collaborate more closely with other disciplines, including urban planners, architects, and climatologists, and of course, across sectors and with local authorities and communities who are those who will be impacted by any evidence-based policy that will improve healthy cities in hot and dry climates. For some reason, my thank you and acknowledgement slide is not here, so I would like to thank you all for listening, and I would like to acknowledge Professor Aviatar El, Dr. Aran Kaftan, and Dr. Karen Agai-Shai for thoughtful comments on this presentation. Over.
Many thanks, Maya. That was great. Some wonderful examples of what actually can be done. I think probably a bit later we're going to hear some more from Sarah on this, because it's a very important issue. The heat islands, rising temperatures, drought as well. I saw that we are in the driest period for the last 11 years, for decades, or for centuries. So we'll come back to that. We're going to take questions as part of the panel discussion, because of time, we're going to move on. Our next speaker is Matthew Baldwin from the European Commission. We're very delighted to have him here. Matthew is very busy at the moment, solving all our problems. And he will be talking how to accelerate progress towards carbon neutral cities, and it takes an important part in there as well. Matthew, are you there? I can't see you at the moment.
I'm here. I'm here. Pop up. Hi, Mark.
Going at 30 kilometers per hour. That's good. The screen is yours, Matthew.
It feels like today I'm going a bit more than 30 kilometers an hour. Yeah, you're right. You kindly accommodated me coming earlier in your agenda, and thanks a lot for swapping me around. But the good or the bad news, depending on your point of view, is I managed to get out of my immediate problems afterwards. So, I mean, I could have taken the original slot. I just didn't want to put you, but I was able to stick around for questions, which is great. I'm looking with great envy at what Maya was describing about the terrible problems of shade. I know it's not a laughing matter, but you know, looking at it from a Brussels perspective, I could use a little bit of that, just a little teeny weeny bit. But I'm here to talk to you about, well, I'd like to talk about several things. I'm coming at you with three hats on in the European Commission. I am the EU's coordinator for road safety, which we've touched on a little bit with James. Also for sustainable mobility, and I'm very glad to have those two issues brigaded together, because you can't have safety without sustainability, and vice versa, in my humble opinion. But recently I've taken on an even more exciting challenge, or at least I think so, which is to manage a mission, as we're calling it, to try to get 100 climate neutral cities in the European Union by 2030, which is a tall order, but I love the scale of the challenge, and I'll come on to that. I want to talk about how we in Europe are getting at this issue. And I'll start with the big picture, and I'll go quickly because you know it. But the European Union, I think, after probably many years of hesitation and division, has decided to go full on after the Paris climate goals. We've taken this concept called the European Green Deal. We have ambitious, extremely ambitious targets for 2050, of course, but by 2030, we're looking for at least 55% greenhouse gas, climate emission reductions by 2030. And why it's not complicated, it's an overused word, but it's an existential challenge, and it's one that we accept. I think, stepping back even further, we have made enormous progress in recent years. I was at the fateful Copenhagen summit in 2008 with President Barroso, and it felt like a bit like we could be looking at the end of our efforts. But since then, you've got Europe, and I'm proud to say so, accepting an increasing level of ambition and an increasing level of responsibility. China is slowly turning the corner. India is slowly turning the corner. The US, well, that's another story in itself, but things look better right now. And if you look at our own member states, we were fighting with most of them a few years back about ambitious targets. And now I think we have a strong phalanx of member states, many of them green, but not all green, pushing each other and signing up to new levels of ambition. I'd just like to say en passant that COVID, if anything, has accelerated those trends. It didn't always look so. I mean, I know that Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was under pressure when she made her State of the Union speech in September to step back, to pause, if you like, to say we can't continue to pursue this level of ambition in the middle of a crisis. But she consciously didn't do that. She chose to push ahead. She said the reason we embrace these 55% levels of ambition is because we can do it. Yeah, there are some people who'd like to go slower. Yeah, there are some people who'd like to go faster. But we've costed, we've tested, we've checked. We can do this, and we should do this if we're going to keep a global leadership. In the world of transport, I work in DG Move. I probably should have said that, our Transport Director General. And we have proposed recently, I think, a seismic shift in our sustainable and smart mobility strategy towards ensuring that each mode in itself is sustainable. So we're not just talking about modal shift, we're saying every mode has to get there. We're saying that there must be sustainable alternatives in the short term, because not every mode is going to become immediately sustainable. Hello shipping, hello aviation, hello cars in the very short run. So we need to provide those alternatives, and we need to incentivize and promote those alternatives. We're going to take that one step further later this year with a new urban mobility package. All the different things we do on urban mobility, James has mentioned some of them, but centered around strengthening of the concept of sustainable urban mobility plans, whereby cities and regions themselves set out what they're ready to do. DG ENER with its renovation wave and its huge level of ambition on energy efficiency and energy generation. DG Klima with the Climate Pact, taking forward across the board with all different stakeholders. There are so many things going on. And if I may make one point, it's not just about political ambition. I think we've advanced the economic case for action. And here I want to pick up some of the things that James and Maya were touching on. And in horrible economists' jargon, what we have done is made great progress towards the concept of internalizing our externalities. We know, for example, to take mobility as an example, just how many external costs are imposed on the rest of society by the users of mobility. We've actually now put a number on those costs. In the European alone, those external costs amount to 1 trillion euros every year. Now, some of those are internalized in our jargon, taken up by taxes and by charges, but about 65% of them are not. And when you look at the areas of external cost is where it gets really exciting for me. Around 40% of them can be categorized as environmental, climate change, air quality, noise, James mentioned, habitat degradation. 30% of it is the cost of road crashes, and around 30% is the cost of road congestion. In other words, the less than optimal costs borne by the rest of society. What is interesting to me when you look at that from an urban perspective is that with one or two radical strokes, ending our dependence on privately owned, conventionally fueled cars, you start to address immediately that those external costs. And you can do so by lots of different ways. Personally, I'm not in favor of banning cars from city centres. I am deeply in favor of pricing them, bringing market economics, no more than that. The revolutionary concept of market pricing to a finite resource, our public spaces, our roads. And immediately you see, if you with congestion pricing, with emission pricing, we can start to do that. And of course, in doing so, we start to address the climate challenge, and we address all what I call the co-benefits. We get better air quality. We reduce the number of people who are killed and seriously injured on our roads. We reduce our congestion. We reduce our noise. It's the gift that keeps on giving. I mean, if you like, what it does expose is the utter bankruptcy of our societal dependence on the private car, at least in cities. But also it exposes the need, and I'm coming now to the point on cities, to help cities develop revenue streams through carbon and congestion pricing, for example. Because otherwise, this decarbonization effort, this effort to make cities climate neutral, is going to be an uphill struggle for cities who are not rich following the 2008 financial crisis and not rich following COVID. So what can we do more with cities at the European level? Why is that so important? 70% of us are living in cities already. We'll be 85% in the European Union by 2050, on just 3% of the world's land, but producing 85% of GDP. And by the way, 72% of our emissions. Why cities? Because that's where the political energy is, and that's where the political ambition to address climate change and deliver those related co-benefits is. These are the places where climate neutrality is most doable in terms of the practical senses, in the words, in addressing mobility, in addressing buildings efficiency, in addressing waste management and energy generation. And it's where it's most politically viable too, because people are choosing to go and live in cities where these issues are being tackled, where, for example, we're developing new active mobility in cities across the world. It's not so evident if you look at it from a European institutional point of view that we at the European Commission should be addressing cities. Member states get quite cross. When are you talking to these cities which are run by our opposition mayors, for example? They say this is not for you to deal with. But if you look at the different number of urban initiatives, including just on climate or greening of cities across the European Commission, there are already many of them, and I'm sure many of you are working with them. The Covenant of Mayors, the Smart Cities Marketplace, the Urban Mobility Strategy, Civitas projects, the glories of Civitas projects, the Green City Accords, the Climate Pact, all the different activities run by our colleagues in DG Regio around the urban agenda. And so to come to my last hat, this crazy mission to come with 100 climate neutral cities by 2030, it's an attempt to try to provide for cities a bit more of a one-stop shop for all those activities related to climate neutrality, a political focus for that work, to challenge cities to come with a target and a timetable, and in return to offer them a contract of a packaging of financial and policy support. So in the mission we have two objectives. Firstly, to bring in big cities as well as small cities that can make a real difference to the European Green Deal targets by 2030, cities that we can therefore really see emissions coming down across the European Union if they join the scheme, but also to use this mission as a test bed for all the different ways that cities of different geographic location, different levels of preparedness, different levels of size, different levels of political willingness need to do to take that journey by 2050 when Europe collectively has to be carbon neutral. Our goal is not to supplant all the brilliant initiatives that are already happening, but to harness them, to work well with them, to add value to them, and again, to provide cities with much more of a one-stop shop. So again, I stress the diversity of this challenge. We want diverse cities. As Bill Clinton once said, we want a group of cities that looks like Europe. We can't just work with the usual suspects in the north where they're one step towards delivering it already. I want to see the southern and the eastern cities of Europe participating. And we want to develop for them a real package of funding and financial policy support. It's kind of full on at the moment as we're trying to get underway. We're developing an implementation plan, which we hope to release in June. There's a lot of pent-up excitement and energy in cities urging us to go further and faster, and I can't wait to get underway. But I better stop there. I think I've used all my time and probably a bit more besides. Thanks very much indeed. Looking forward to sticking around for the discussion.
Many thanks, Matthew. This was really inspiring talk, and it's nice to hear that you can see many positive sides in this and possibilities for the Europe to become carbon neutral and sustainable. We are still on time in our schedule, and I will then give the floor to Sarah Maya, who will talk about the nature-based solutions, contribution towards urban climate resilience and human well-being. Please, Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. I'll just quickly share my screen.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity actually to present at this webinar. Today I will focus my analysis on the on nature-based solutions and its contribution to address both urban climate resilience and human well-being as part of the Nature-Vision project. Nature-Vision project started in 2016. It's a 4-year project that focused on the role of nature-based solutions and trying to understand what nature-based solutions can achieve regarding urban sustainability challenges, with a focus on innovation. And here is our website in case someone would like to check it in detail. Very briefly, I will introduce what are nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions are understood as human-made interventions that are either inspired or supported by nature. They are specifically tailored to local contexts and are specifically designed to address urban problems, urban societal challenges. They can help build resilience while protecting our ecosystems and being cost-effective. Nature-based solutions can take many forms. You can see here, this is the typology of nature-based solutions in the Nature-Vision project. You can see the first example includes like green roofs and green walls. You can also have large urban parks and forests, small projects, community-led projects like allotment gardens and community gardens. They can also be green indoor areas, as you can see here in the picture. Blue areas, commonly well known, and also green areas for water management. Nature-based solutions can deliver many benefits depending also on the type of NBS that we are looking. For example, if you think of a large park, a park can deliver like environmental benefits related with temperature reduction, which was already mentioned in the webinar today. It can also help with biodiversity protection and also deliver many social and ecological benefits, as we can see here. Today, my analysis will focus on one of the outputs of the Nature-Vision project, which is the Urban Nature Atlas. This is the most comprehensive database of nature-based solutions across Europe. Currently, we have 1,000 projects from 100 European cities, and it was developed basically to understand the landscape of nature-based solutions in Europe. The Urban Nature Atlas was developed actually in 2017. Since then, we have updated it last year, where we basically looked at what has happened with this project since 2017 and actually added a few more questions. The Urban Nature Atlas was produced as the result of a systematic survey based on data collection that was done as a result of a desktop research project and based on sources of data. The database is currently online, so anyone who would like to know more about these projects can find it on naturevision.eu. Here, for example, is just a brief overview of the cities that we have currently in the Urban Nature Atlas. As I mentioned earlier, nature-based solutions can provide many benefits. They can also address many challenges. Here, for example, you can see the sustainability challenges that were designed or selected within Nature-Vision. Some of them, as you can see here, are environmental focus, like climate action, water management, or environmental quality. Some of them are related with social issues, like health and well-being and social justice. And we also include economic development. They were selected based or identified based on the SDGs and also the Eclipse report. And today on my presentation, I will focus mostly on the climate action and the health challenge, as this is the focus of today's presentation. Here in this graph, you can see, for example, all the challenges that I just mentioned earlier, and based on the 1,000 projects that we studied within the Urban Nature Atlas, the sustainability challenges that are most often selected by NBS implementation. As you can see, the main one is green space and biodiversity. This is very common, and this is also reflects on the impacts of the projects. The second most common challenge is actually health and well-being, where over 60% of the projects aim to address health and well-being goals, followed by urban regeneration, social justice, and as you can see, over around 30% of the projects also aim to address climate action. When we actually intersect both of these challenges, health and well-being and climate actions, we actually have around 18% of the projects in the Urban Nature Atlas that aim to address both problems. And these will be actually the projects that I will focus my analysis today. And just to quickly go through an example of what can be one project that aims to address these both problems. This is, as you can see here in the picture, is a hospital in Germany, where basically this new urban project was developed so that the hospital actually has a green space. As you can see here, within the hospital, there's a green roof where actually patients can go and rest, get some fresh air. But besides having these health benefits related with relaxation, the green roof actually helps with lowering local temperature. It also helps with improving water management because it has sustainable urban drainage systems as one of the different nature-based solutions included in the project. And it also helps with overall aesthetic improvements, as you can see. So focusing on the nature-based solutions that aim to tackle both climate action and human health goals, when we focus, for example, on the health goals, we can see that the most common health goal is usually creation of opportunities for recreation. You can see almost 90% of the project. But when we actually looked at specific goals that aim to focus on improving of mental or physical health, usually there's a less number of projects that focus on specific health goals. When we look at climate action, for example, over 70% of the projects focus on climate change adaptation, while 46% of the projects focus on mitigation, although there's also an overlap. There's projects that aim to address both sub-goals. Here I will quickly focus on these goals that I just mentioned about climate change adaptation. When we look at adaptation, for example, the most common one is usually reducing the impacts of climate risks. And you can see also some of the implementation activities that I just included here. Usually, and more often, it's related with increasing urban green space for reducing urban heat, also in general, cooling outdoor spaces, and also implementing sustainable urban drainage systems to improve the water management, as the example that I just showed. Regarding mitigation goals, usually the most common implementation activities are related also with carbon storage and overall reducing energy demand through nature-based solutions. When we look at the urban settings, and by urban settings, I mean the types of nature-based solutions, projects that aim to tackle both climate action and health and well-being. More often they are urban parks. They can be large urban parks or pocket parks, especially within residential areas. Pocket parks are very common for both having impacts related with lowering temperatures and also for providing spaces for physical activity and recreation. Street trees as well as an example of green infrastructure with green features, and also green corridors that also bridge this gap within urban areas for tackling both of these problems. When we look at specifically this type of projects, they are usually large-scale projects like the green corridor that I just mentioned. And this also reflects on the type of innovation that these projects are related to, which more often than not, they are actually systemic innovation that involves both technological and infrastructural innovation aspects with social aspects as well. When we look at the governance arrangements responsible for the implementation or enabling the implementation of nature-based solutions, more commonly for these type of projects, they are co-led, which means that there is some kind of hybrid of governance arrangements, where most commonly the key initiating organization will be local governments like municipalities, with also non-government actors involved, which usually are NGOs, private sector, or community groups, usually as part of activities or activities that are related with the commonly implementation of the projects. They are usually through joint implementation. For example, we have the planting of trees as one common activity. There's also co-planning, of course, and consultation. When we look at the policy drivers that are responsible for NBS implementation, 68% of these projects that we studied are responsible or are implemented based on local strategies and regulations. 56% of the projects are actually considered voluntary, and usually the voluntary projects are related with environmental standards. When we talk about enablers, what is the reason behind the NBS implementation? We found that 56% of the projects are actually enabled based on specific city level or green infrastructure or NBS plans. Usually these are related with either biodiversity strategies, with urban redevelopment plans, city level environmental plans, and also spatial guidance. When we look at the financing, we found that these projects that aim to tackle goals related with climate action and health are actually quite large projects, which also is in accordance with what I just mentioned about the spatial scale of the projects. They are usually above 4 million euros. And this was also a finding that compared with the other 1,000 projects that we have in the Atlas with the overall database, still the predominance of a large financial scale and a large budget is still quite high. When we look at the impacts of these projects, as you can see here, the most common impact or impact category is actually green space and habitat, which is very much related with the fact that I mentioned that like 90% of the projects aim to address green space and biodiversity goals. But as you can see, the second most common impact and the third most common impact are actually health and well-being and climate change. So as you can see here, around 60% of these projects that aim to address climate action and health and well-being actually deliver or express to deliver impacts related with these impact categories. But we also found other impacts that were also found in connection with these projects, which usually are related with increasing green space area or improving biodiversity or improving air quality as well, which also has impacts on health, of course. Increased opportunities for social recreation is also one of them. Common co-benefits. When we look at, for example, specifically the climate change impacts that these projects deliver, we found that 75% of the projects that aim to deliver or to address climate change goals actually have benefits related with it. The most common, as you can see here on the first figure, is lowering local temperature, followed closely by carbon sequestration, and also just overall improving urban resilience. When we look at the health impacts, we can see that 80% of the projects that aim to address both climate action and health and well-being challenges actually deliver health-related impacts. But what we found quite interesting is that most of the projects, as you can see here, 120 out of 176 projects, expressed impacts related with gaining activities of recreation and exercise. But when you look specifically at the improved physical health and mental health of the benefits of these projects, the percentages, I mean, the numbers are quite lower. So this might mean there's actually a lack of evidence of such benefits or methods to actually measure these benefits. Just a quick summary of what I went through, because I think I covered quite so many things. So nature-based solutions have the potential to address both climate action and health goals within the same type of projects. 18% of the projects included in this large database actually cover both goals. The most common types of nature-based solutions, which is what we mean by urban settings, are large urban parks, pocket parks, street trees, and green corridors. These are usually large projects at district scale and also with a large budget. They are most often co-led by local municipalities and cities, and they are most often enabled by local policies related with environmental guidance. When we look at the impacts of these projects, we know that NBS have the ability to deliver several benefits simultaneously, and this is expressed by the data that I just showcased, and that 75% of these projects actually deliver climate change related impacts. These are more often related with temperature reduction, with carbon sequestration, and urban resilience. 80% of the projects also aim to address health goals or had health impacts. and most often these are related with the creation of opportunities for recreation and physical activity. But despite the number of projects that actually express benefits related with health, there's a lack of evidence for the actual physical health and mental health benefits of urban nature. So my main conclusion is that there's actually a lack of integrated assessment methods that actually look at the co-benefits of nature-based solutions and the trade-offs in a context-dependent manner. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present my work. If there's any questions, I will be in the discussion. And,
thanks so much, Sarah. That was great. I mean, what a great analysis you've done for this. I think we're going to take questions as part of the panel discussion because we've been doing it so far. So I suggest that we move on, and then when the questions come up, and I'm sure there will be a few, then we'll address them later. So we go to our last presentation. It's Maria Jose Rojo from the Polis Network will be talking about how the production of new knowledge, how to respond to stakeholder and user needs. In this case, that Maria Jose, the screen is yours.
Hello, I hope you can see my screen and you can hear me as well.
So we go to urban mobility, from nature-based solutions to urban mobility. God, we're covering a lot of ground this afternoon. Thanks so much. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So indeed, today I will speak about the promotion of health to sustainable urban mobility from the perspective of cities. I work for Polis Network, that is the network of European cities and regions working together to deploy innovative solutions for more sustainable mobility. And currently the network is formed by more than 80 cities and regions, as well as associated members, such as research institutions. And at Polis, we help our members gain access to European research and innovation projects, and we act as their voice towards the European institutions. We also facilitate peer-to-peer exchange between cities through the different working groups that are thematically linked to each of the pillars that you can see here in this slide. And the working group on active travel and health looks at the impact that urban and regional transport has on the environment and on health, with a focus on the role of soft modes of transport, such as walking and cycling. So in order for the objectives of the Green Deal for Europe to become a climate neutral economy by 2050, this can only be obtained by increasing the sustainability of the transport sector, as was mentioned already. And for this to happen, a shift to active travel is important as part of this transformation. Promoting active travel has the potential not only of improving air quality, but also to improve physical and mental health, reduce noise, improve road safety, and reduce inequalities. Many of these topics have been already discussed in the previous presentations. So during the pandemic, many people started to cycle as a means of transport, experiencing their cities as cyclists with more space, cleaner air, and less noise. And mobility behaviors are difficult to change, but COVID-19 pandemic has provided an opportunity for many people to shift to active travel behaviors in a lasting way. There has also been an increase in cycling infrastructure, according to this graph from ICF's COVID-19 tracker. Since the beginning of the outbreak, there have been more than 2,500 kilometers of new cycle lanes announced throughout Europe, of which almost 1,500 have been implemented. So at Polis, we are engaging with our cities, for example, with Berlin, Lisbon, Brussels, Paris, and others, on the challenges faced when implementing this emergency infrastructure and how it can become permanent, meeting, of course, the adequate safety requirements. The use of bicycles and e-bikes is on the rise. Some cities, for example, Madrid, are extending their bike sharing system in both in number of vehicles and in extent of the network. And also the sales of bikes and e-bikes has spiked This is, for example, a graph from a new forecast for the cycling sector that shows that Europeans are expected to buy an extra 10 million bikes per year by 2030, which is roughly 50% more than the annual number in 2019. And interestingly, leading the way in the curve are the e-bikes, as you can see. E-bikes make cycling a viable option for new groups of users, including those that are less fit and also the elderly. And they also create a possibility to cycle faster and on longer distances, and provides a substitute to car trips that might be too distant or unpleasant for a pedal bike. Here we can see as well how public bike sharing systems are being expanded, and also other cities are deploying services such as long-term electric bike system. For example, the Bellico location by Ile-de-France, which is considered the largest in the world, and also some incentives for purchasing bikes and e-bikes and cargo bikes to nudge people away from their cars are also increasing, especially after the pandemic. For example, we have cases of these in France, Italy, Portugal, and Madrid that are offering now rebates for those buying e-bikes. So this is important because in order to harness the full potential that cycling can bring, cycling must be promoted not only in the inner cores of cities, but also in the surroundings of the city, connecting the suburbs with the city core, and connecting the different districts, like providing a more even amount of infrastructure overall in the city. People living in the suburban areas are usually more prone to depending on private motorized vehicles. So that's why investing in safe, high quality, efficient, comfortable cycling networks in combination with improved access to bikes and e-bikes can provide an alternative for car trips, and this way can reduce congestion in and around cities. In this line, as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, Ile-de-France presented an ambitious plan for 650 kilometers of cycle paths across the region. This cycling network replicates the urban train network of the region and answers to this lack of continuity in the cycling paths. But other cities are also developing network approach cycling plans, for example, Brussels, Rome, London, Milan, Lisbon, and other cities. Also, many cities are investing in cycle highway networks that have the potential to also link cities with other cities or towns that are at cycling distance. And this is, for example, an approach that's taken by the Flanders region in Belgium, by Twente region in Netherlands, and other regions, thus reducing as well congestion in these regions. But not only cycling, but also enabling safe walking is also key for achieving healthy and resilient cities. Walking is the first step in every journey, and it's also an affordable, inclusive, healthy, active mode. During this pandemic, its importance has been confirmed when many cities needed to expand their sidewalks and rebalance public space to ensure physical distance. And now many cities are working on their walking strategies. For example, Rotterdam's the pedestrian in a pedestal strategy. Here we can see a mapping exercise where citizens were asked to identify areas that are pleasant to walk around and other areas that actually need further improvement. The final aim, as also was mentioned before, is to achieve cities where all the activities needed for a living, so working, having leisure, having access to provisions, access to care, can be reached within a short walk or bike ride. And this way, a car dependency can be reduced. So urban vehicle access regulations can be a useful tool, not just to tackle air pollution, but also to improve livability in cities. Barcelona has demonstrated the multiple benefits that this model can bring and its positive impact in public health. But now other cities, for example, Berlin and Vienna, are working on adapted versions of the superblock model. And I'd also like to speak a bit about the REVEAL project, which is a European funded project precisely looking at this topic of urban vehicle access regulations and how to help cities implement them in a more successful way. Within the REVEAL city, within the REVEAL project, the city of Vitoria-Gasteiz is working on the implementation of 2 superblocks and has plans to develop further superblocks in other parts of the city. But REVEAL is not only about physical interventions, as we call this kind of UBARs. It also looks at pathway to zero emission zones, congestion pricing, etc. And it's also developing a methodology to accompany cities in the process of implementing these kind of measures, and looks at different aspects that are important in this process. For example, governance and financing, user needs and acceptance, which was also mentioned in the chat I saw before, and other issues that are crucial for its implementation. Mobility options as well that are important as complementary measures, etc. Mentioning as well electromobility, which should always go hand in hand with this model shift, but however, it can play a major role for the high usage fleets, such as public transport and logistics. And cities such as Vienna can serve as an example, where the use of alternative fuel buses in combination with policies encouraging the use of public transport raised the model share of public transport to 39%, while it causes only 6% of the city's transport-related CO2 emissions. We in Polis believe that post-Euro 6 standards can be seen as a tool to protect our environment, and the needs and opinions of cities should be considered in the discussion both at the national and also at the European level. And finally, I'd like to highlight this SUMP topic guide, which has recently been published. It's called Planning for More Resilient and Robust Urban Mobility. It's aligned with the SUMP process, and it was informed by the knowledge produced in multiple European research projects, that most of them fall under the Civitas umbrella, and they're named there. I think it was up to 18 European projects. So what this guide aims to do is building on the lessons learned during the COVID-19 pandemic. This guide presents possible ways to accelerate the transition towards more resilient and sustainable urban mobility systems, increasing the preparedness for future crises that may arise. This is where the concept of resilience is being introduced. And it provides best practices, examples, and recommendations along different measure fields. Today we've spoken about several of them that need to be transformed in order to achieve this goal of achieving more resilient and more healthy cities. So I recommend this document, and here in the slides you can find some reference to documents that I've been mentioning. So thanks a lot for listening. I look forward to the discussion.
Great, many thanks, Maria Jose. That was an excellent presentation, and it's nice to see that these guidelines and suggestions are already available for the cities. Now I would like to invite all our speakers for the discussion. Please turn on your videos.
Yeah, if I can say something also, because, you know, listening to the talks, it's great. I mean, many problems have been identified, but also many solutions already. I think that's so encouraging to see that we're on the way to solutions. We know how to starting to address them. I mean, I guess there are still some barriers for the solution, and I'm hoping to come back to that later. But I think that's one of the messages that I get away from listening to all the talks, that solutions are on the way.
Yes, and thank you for the audience. You have posted some questions for our speakers, and some of them have already been answered. But if I can start with one that can be addressed by any of you, there is a concern that cars are often considered as a status symbol. and how can we get people out of this thinking that you need to have a car and you can go to the public transportation and other mobility possibilities? And I see Matthew is raising his hand, so you can go first.
Yeah, I wanted to answer because I tried to answer. I've been writing and I think I lost my answer somewhere. So in frustration, I'm determined to speak it. I think it's a great point. I really do. Margaret Thatcher, anyone remember her? Famously said that if you're taking the bus at the age of 30, then you're a loser in life. Certainly if you're riding a bike around in the 1970s or 80s, and yes, I am old enough to remember that, it's because you couldn't afford a car. It was an inferior good. In a curious way, I think we're almost going too much in the other direction. I mean, you see Wall Street bankers now with their $10,000 super duper racing bikes competing for the latest Lycra look. It's becoming, the risk is that bicycling in particular, I think, is seen as the privilege of sort of snobby metropolitan elites. Where the happy medium lies, if you look at many Dutch cities, or Copenhagen is the classic one, where cycling is just the best way to get around. It's simply the cheapest or the most effective way. And most of the people who ride a bicycle in Copenhagen would hate to be thought of as bicyclists. It's just how you get from A to B. And that's when we will have succeeded, where the cost-benefit ratio, private cars are, as you say in your question, not needed and not useful and are recognized as the kind of space-hogging, polluting monsters that we don't need anymore. That's where we need to get to. Easier said than done.
I have the idea going a bit further on this, that it's different for the younger generation. I think they value other things more. I mean, I have the idea that I'm happy with having a smartphone or having their computer and getting connected without having to bother about the car. I mean, I don't know the numbers here. I saw at one stage in the US that the younger generation didn't go for the driver's license anymore. I don't know what it's in Europe.
Yeah, and it's definitely dropping. It's definitely dropping. And ownership of a car is definitely dropping, Mark. I mean, the sense that, and this is where the shared mobility comes in. We shouldn't be too doctrinaire about it. You might need a car on occasion, but there's absolutely no reason to own a car anymore. It's madness in a modern city. And so it's about, again, incentivizing the alternative, making sure the private sector can provide preferably electric or alternatively fueled cars that you don't need to own.
Yeah, Matthew, while you're at it, because I saw this comment about the car, leaving it up to market forces, and I suggested that was not what you wanted to say. I mean, perhaps you could say what you were looking after to say in a way, in a bit clearer way, not to leave the wrong impression.
I was a bit clumsy. By the way, I think the last time I spoke to you, Mark, you look like you're about 10 years younger with the hair and the whole look. I look about 10 years older. I came across as a bit of a neoliberal, I think, in saying that. But look, in a way, why should we accept market forces in all areas of our lives? In the houses or flats we live in, the restaurants we eat in, the cars we own or buy. But then suddenly we say that the space which you drive on, which is collectively owned, by the way, that's free. Why should people driving expensive large SUVs be able to go into town for free when they're imposing a cost on the rest of society? And that's doubly so if you look at the numbers as to who owns cars. Less than 50% of the households in Brussels have access to a car. I think I'm right in saying that 2/3 of the poorer neighborhoods of Berlin have no access to a car. And look at the way we provide pedestrian spaces in cities. You get beautifully laid out pavements or sidewalks if you're in North America in places where everyone is driving a car, and in poor neighborhoods you have no space for pedestrians. It makes absolutely no sense. We haven't addressed this issue with equity in mind, and that is the way to address this issue. But ultimately there is no alternative to charging people for what they use. And then if we're creative about it, if you're a plumber going around your business, although, by the way, you could use a cargo e-bike a lot of the time, you should be allowed to do so. I mean, it's an essential means of traveling. And we also need to smooth it out by helping people who are coming in from the suburbs to have sustainable journeys in without being stuck using a car. Free park and ride facilities, good multimodal connections, better use, ability to use public transport into cities. All of this, again, easier said than done. But you're right. The basic point of the question is right. We shouldn't be disadvantaging poorer people by cutting off access to cars. That will be an absolute failure of the policy.
Thank you. Yeah, related to access and getting rid of the old-fashioned cars that we are driving today, there is a question that is also addressed to all the panelists. How important do you think personal electric micromobilities, often shared, might become, like e-scooters, e-bikes, e-motorcycles? We heard that there have been an increase in e-bike purchases during the COVID pandemic. So maybe Maria Jose, would you have any idea how this might go on in the future?
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. I think they do play an important role, especially when thinking of the last mile in southern Germany. So they can be seen as a complement also to public transport when the last mile can be covered by these kind of shared electromobility services. So in some cases, and in order to also address the issue of having access in different parts of the city and not only in the most affluent part of the city, that's mostly when now these shared services are available. In some cases, it can be helpful also to subsidize these kind of services in suburbs or areas that have less density in order to make this connection with public transport, because in fact, they can work very well together. But this is, of course, a topic that needs to be tackled with a lot of care. Mm-hmm.
I would like to move a little bit from mobility to the other aspect, the nature-based solutions and the heating. Sarah, I mean, you mentioned like tree planting in cities. You mentioned it as one of the nature-based solutions. And I wonder if you have some idea to how realistic it is. I mean, often there is not enough space. How can you create space for tree planting and integrate other aspects? Do you have specific examples, and do you have some idea to what extent it's possible?
Mm-hmm. So from what we saw from the database from the Urban Nature Atlas, the tree planting activities were usually co-led projects that actually the interest was demonstrated actually by the citizens, that they were interested. For example, usually this happens in the outskirts of cities. For example, in Romania, I remember the curtain forest. So the city had problems in winter with very strong winds and in summer with very hot weather. So one of the solutions was one of the nature-based solutions was actually to plant a curtain, they call it a curtain forest on the outskirts of the city that would help both in winter and both in summer with the temperature. And it was actually co-led by citizens in the municipality. It was, a tree planting activity that everyone could participate with volunteers, of course. And that example was in the outskirts of the city. We have another project, for example, in Sintra in Portugal, where there was already a forest, but due to the summer forest fires, actually a lot of the trees had to be replanted. So again, that was a community-led initiative to actually plant more trees within that area. Yeah.
But often where we lack trees, or also like in the city centers, do you see opportunity there for replacing current space that is used in a different way for trees?
Yes, we also found we call it the relict areas that are in the core of the city, but were not currently being used by nature or was just abandoned, sometimes also on the outskirts of the cities. And we noticed, especially on the update of the data that we did from 2017 to 2020, that more of those places are actually being now used for nature, again, by citizens initiative or requesting it, and more and more of those spaces are actually being used by nature now.
Maya, perhaps you can say something as well, because I see in Israel there's quite a lot going on, and also this particular issue, if there's some integration with indoor and outdoor greening, bringing it together. I think I saw some really nice pictures of you where there are green infrastructure, and I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Thank
Maya?
you for the question.
Yeah.
Hi. Yes, I think that there is a beginning of some examples of integrating indoor and outdoor spaces. It's initial. I think it's more possible in new projects that are being built, but it's much more challenging with existing projects. For example, in the case of urban renewal, where housing is already private property and is harder to intervene in together with public space unless all citizens agree to that. One interesting example where it is possible is public housing, where the country sometimes provides funding for urban renewal that includes both indoor and outdoor retrofitting, both greening and more thermal isolation, and making houses more sustainable. These are rare examples over here at the moment.
Thank you. Jana?
Yes, I think this one might go to Sarah. There was a question about, have you had any experiences about growing food within cities? And that would give perhaps some health benefits as well, growing healthy foods, vegetables, fruits.
Yeah, I was just now trying to answer on the chat, but yes, we found a lot of projects that we call them community gardens or allotment gardens within cities that are purposely designed to actually grow vegetables and fruits. Sometimes, I think Lisa in her comment, she mentioned where it's to help poor people. We found that a lot of these gardens are actually, the intention behind creating these spaces is also to address problems with marginalized groups, society groups. Sometimes, for example, it's just older people that need an occupation, and this is something that actually helps with their well-being and health and even interacting with other people. But sometimes it's also community groups that are sometimes excluded from society or in their neighborhood. So those projects actually have a very strong component on regarding social justice, and they are more and more common. It's one also of the sustainability challenges of nature-based solutions can be the sustainable consumption and production, that it's very, very related with allotment gardens and community gardens that, besides having environmental benefits, also have these recreational and social interaction type of benefits.
Good, thanks. Next question is for James. James, you mentioned that there is still a lot of road building going on. And I think the treasurers, I mean, they always like road building because they see it as being equivalent to economic development. I wonder if you could comment on this, if this is still true in a way, and how do you see the future for this?
In terms of whether there is a relationship between, I mean, I must say, I haven't looked at the evidence. When I last looked at this a few years ago, the evidence was really quite weak. I mean, it's assumed the economic models, but assume that road building, because it increases connectivity, but will benefit economic growth. But you know, any expenditure, any public expenditure is putting money into the economy, can have benefits on economic growth. And this idea that kind of you've got to consider also the way that road transit, building more roads, increasing cars can lead to more sprawl, can lead to things being further away, decreasing accessibility. If you think about actually, you know, prioritizing people's needs for accessibility, to me that is likely to have the biggest kind of bang for buck in terms of, you know, economic growth, in terms of economic development. It's thinking about you know, the how we design the 15-minute city, how we design things so that things are can be achieved with kind of relatively low resource, rather than, I mean, there's also the risk that it's just a measure of throughput. You know, the kind of economic growth arguments that because it takes a lot of resources, because you have to use the car, you have to build the infrastructure, you have to have the cars and all the fuel to power it, then you're seeing that as somehow good in itself, while because that, you know, rather than thinking about actually meeting, you know, citizens' needs.
Yeah, you mentioned the 15-minute city. To what extent, how realistic do you think it actually is? Because I mean, it asks for a kind of really major rethink of how we organize our cities. I mean, at the moment, you know, we have rich, poor areas. The 15-minute city suggests that everyone lives together. I mean, do you think it's realistic?
Well, I think there's a lot of points there. I mean, I think one point I was making was, you know, cities are starting in different places, and I think this was, I was talking about some of the positive ideas that I felt were coming out. I don't think we can say every city, particularly as we really need to make some, you know, improvements over the next 10, 15 years, you know, we're at different places, so we've got to move it, you know, move in a different way. I think it's a direction of travel for sure. I think in many cities, of course, you do also have, you know, it varies. Some cities you do have the rich and poor living quite close together. I mean, you know, again, there isn't one thing to that. But I think it also says we do have to think about housing and transport together. And I mean, certainly in the UK, we have massive housing inequality by income, but also by age, because of how the housing market has become so expensive, and young people just can't afford it compared to the situation of older people. And you know, sometimes we expect transport, I think, to do too much. And it's like, well, what about the inequities? And it's like, well, yeah, but the inequity isn't really to do with transport in some of these things. It's to do with wider societal inequity, and particularly in the housing market, or the lack of social housing that we have. We have to. You can't expect transport to fix all of those things. I'm not saying we should ignore them, but you can't put them all on transport. You have to bring these things together.
I can see that Matthew has some point on something to say about this. That he's sitting on on his chair.
No, I totally agree with James. I'm not going to. James has forgotten more than I'll ever learn about this stuff, so it's kind of cheeky for me to come in after him. But I totally agree. I mean, a couple of points if I may. Firstly, that I agree with the transport can't solve the equity issues, but transport, if we get it right, can actually contribute to that. It's not. I mean, in the ways I mentioned earlier, and transport can't be an equity-free zone or a gender equity-free zone. Too often, transport has been in the past. Second point, very much in agreement with James, it's the direction of travel, and I'm feeling that this when I'm looking at this almost impossible mountain of 100 climate-neutral cities in the EU. I mean, let's go for it. If we don't make it, we're still going to be better off than we've done nothing. It's about the direction of travel. And everywhere I've gone and talked about urban mobility, you have people saying, well, yeah, I mean, Copenhagen, the Netherlands, well, couldn't happen here. We're too hot, too rainy, too hilly, too, I don't know what. And then you turn around and you can do it. Brussels is becoming a biking city. Brussels, car mad Brussels. Dutch cities, you know better than me, Mark, they used to be, the medieval squares of Dutch cities used to be used as big car parks. Not anymore. Things change. So let's push and see how far we get.
Can I go on to this? Because I think that there is still to some extent, some zoning going on where, you know, in certain parts of the city, you've got the office buildings, the other parts you're building. This is, I think, still quite ingrained in planning. I wonder, do you feel the same? And how could we address this?
You mean me? I'm probably the least qualified person on this panel to answer that. I mean, yes is my answer, but I don't think I know enough.
Anyone knows anything about zoning? Marie-José, I see your hand is up.
Leave it also to my colleagues, but I just wanted to mention that I think that in Europe, we are quite lucky in the sense of having city centers that were designed around people and not around cars in the early times. So that's something important to have in mind. So the city have evolved afterwards around the cars, but we can respace again the inner cores of cities. So this is actually a doable task in many cities, although difficult as well, of course, and it requires to have more mixed uses, etc. And regarding the topic of zoning and of having different areas, different uses, which are sometimes further apart, I have no silver bullet or simple solution for this, of course, but I would like to stress the issue of having a network approach, which I also mentioned in my presentation, to a network approach to cycling, good, high quality, safe, efficient networks that can actually provide make it easier to move from A to B, and also in walking also have this perspective of a network in the urban scale.
Yeah, perhaps it's sometimes a bit of around perception. Last night I gave a talk in LA, and there they were saying, actually it was with a group. And
that sounds so cool. That sounds so cool, Mark.
I go all around the world. I mean, but they were saying actually the density in LA is quite high. I mean, we think of LA also as a car city. You can't change it, but according to them, the density is high enough to be able to have a mixed use for many things and not to rely on cars. And I was surprised about that. But then, having said that, I haven't been to LA for 10 years or so. But yes, you're right here. I mean, originally here the cities were designed for walking and for carriages, so it's easier to go back to that model. I think that still I'm worried about what I see where they're building like big office centers on the outskirts of the cities or shopping malls outside. What often drives people to these places rather than that there is good infrastructure for them to cycle or walk to this kind of things they need.
And I think it's very important we don't leave suburbs and further out places. I mean, there is always a risk of anything. It's like a big transport infrastructure project, even a big active travel thing. The tendency can always be to focus on the centres, on the kind of areas that people see more. But perhaps in the European context, they are often easier because that's originally how they were designed. So I mean, it very much has to be thinking about neighbourhoods and how they can be redesigned, and whether you've got higher income people in the centre or further out, but whichever the situation about what the changes that we can do there. And I think with with COVID, with home working, we have also seen that even if not everyone is going to be able to travel to where their job is based, I think that the kind of office hubs does have quite a lot of potential for providing opportunities for people to be working without all the stresses of necessarily working from home and all the kind of outsourcing of space that puts on it in individuals, and having some of the collectivity of an office, but without necessarily always needing to travel in. Let me just move the sun.
What are you doing?
It's like the sun shining in my eyes. Yeah.
Well, here I thought I see an interesting question in the chat. I mean, it's transformative change is presented as the solutions for many issues, including urban development. But what does that mean for your point of view in practical terms in some areas you've presented? Does anyone want to have a go at this? People are shy in a way.
Maybe you need to repeat the question.
Transformative change is presented as the solutions for many issues, including urban development. But what does that mean from your point of view in practical terms in the areas you've presented? So it's a very wide question.
Right. It's
Matthew?
a kind of a silver bullet question as well.
Maya.
So I guess we have to be careful from silver bullet solutions. We know that solutions that are often great on paper find challenges in implementation when they get to stakeholder interests, etc. To me, a transformation would be to make other sectors think health and practice health. For example, over here, the transportation section is very much private car oriented. We have poor active travel networks. And to me, transformation would be to make urban planners, transportation planners, local authorities understand the co-benefits for the health, for the environment, for society, and to start having the knowledge in-house across sectors, so that we don't have to, treat case by case with another health impact assessment or another tool that is brought over from public health trying to convince. Transformation would be change of mindset across sectors.
Thank you. Anyone else or not?
I lost the connection.
Are you gone dark? Yeah. What's happened?
Can you hear me?
Oh,
Yes,
wow. You come from outer space now.
I come from outer space. No, I lost the connection as usual. It's about the 5th time today. Just real quickly on that, and I'm sorry, I was agreeing with everything I heard from my hand until I lost the connection. But just real quickly, this whole notion of transformative change, let's not hide behind the need for new technology to advance. In most of the areas, we have the solutions. We don't need, if I may say to the research community, which I know is online and listening into this, avoid the sense, if I may, from a using perspective in terms of government. I don't think we need lots and lots of new in-depth research for solutions that we can implement in 10 or 15 years. A lot of the research for me is about how we can deploy those solutions. And that's where I urge you to put your efforts, looking for ways in which we can really roll this out at scale, whether it's on urban mobility or energy efficiency or other things. That's where I sense the needs are. And we don't need to solve the problems of urban mobility by making everyone fly around in drones or flying taxis. The solutions are at our feet, almost literally.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting point, Matthew. And I would like to ask each panelist in this way, because many of or all of you brought some solutions. What do you think are some of the main barriers, or is the main barrier for implementing your solution? And what is some of the main facilitator for implementing? Do you see anything specific in terms of barrier or facilitator? And I would like to go down the list that we gave to speakers, like James. Do you have any specific facilitators or barriers that you would like to mention, particularly for your transport solutions?
I mean, achieving these kind of changes, is obviously hard. People are often skeptical about what it's going to be like. Often we have governments that may be pushing one direction and pulling the other at the same time, much as they maybe create some opportunities, but they. I think this in a sense is often where I think there's a lot of research is needed. We need to better understand how to build kind of coalitions that can challenge vested interests, that can bring together in a participatory way people to achieve real substantive change. I mean, I think there is a role for more visioning, for more citizen engagement, perhaps citizens assemblies in trying to really think, what do we want our cities to be like? How do we imagine this going over the next 15, 20 years? And what's the kind of goal that we want to get to? Well, obviously we provide evidence and information and data to get there.
Yeah, I hope the citizens don't want to drive their car, James. That's my concern sometimes.
I think we need to wait. Yeah, I mean, I think we need ways to do this in the context of the climate crisis and the need for change.
Yeah.
It's a tension. It depends where you're doing it as well.
Yeah. Maya, for your part, for the greening, I mean, what do you see as kind of barriers and facilitators?
Right. Well, I think the barriers are the barriers of good governance and good public policy in general. So there's a holy grail in public policy that has been mentioned here. Sectors work in silos, don't communicate, don't integrate, think about the short term rather than the long term. And of course, there is the budget issue. I think that a facilitator would be to show and convince that that the co-benefits across sectors, and that budget is not necessarily higher for this type of solutions. It's just to be distributed differently. And then again, we get to implementation, which is always a challenge, and I think globally. So best practice, showing it works, showing that this kind of solutions create better environment, that the citizens are happier, and giving more evidence-based practice to build on and to imitate.
Thank you, Maya. And Matthew, particularly for your 100 carbon neutral cities, what do you see as facilitators and barriers, some of the main ones?
Well, I'd like to pick up something Maya just mentioned, and that's finance, budgetary issues as well. This, I think, the biggest single problem we face is the chronic indebtedness of cities, hammered by the 2008 financial crisis, hammered by the COVID crisis, and having to run full public transport services with not many people wanting to use them. So if cities want to participate in this, and I think people do want these new, livable, cleaner, greener cities, the things we all love. That's why we're working in this area. But citizens don't want to be taxed to death either. So I think the key, the magic sauce, is trying to develop sustainable revenue streams for some of these new services. If you like, sorry, it seems sounding like a neoliberal economist again, but monetizing the benefits. Lower energy bills, yeah, great, including for people living in old, drafty buildings. But that's where I think congestion pricing, emission pricing is so interesting and attractive, because you're finding a way to ration the activity, and you're also building a revenue stream for while it's still there at the same time. But I'm again looking to the research community to help on this. It's not going to be easy. You can't easily monetize biking or walking in the city. And if we can come up with it whilst keeping those activities going, I want to hear from you.
Excellent, Matthew. I mean, at least you've got your 100 carbon neutral cities, the mission, where it supposedly is going to be a lot of money related to. Although I think the initial calls are only for 2 million. I was a bit disappointed, but I'm sure there is more.
Yeah, it's early days. We've got a certain amount of research money from the Horizon Europe budget. But if you just look at the amounts of money we're talking about, a recent study looking at 100 cities with an average population of 100,000, you're talking about 96 billion euros. And if you bring in the bigger cities, that number is going to multiply. So to tell you a little secret, it can't all come from the European budget. And we're going to need to bring in those private finance sources and use some of the European budget to guarantee and back up some of those risky loans. Not my expertise, so I need help.
Oh, we're happy to help you.
Thank you.
Sarah, what do you see as the facilitators or barriers to the nature-based solutions you presented?
Well, when we look at barriers, I think one of the biggest ones, and especially when we talk about a new concept as nature-based solutions, is actually understanding the potential and the contribution of these types of urban nature, and actually helping make this case for prioritizing nature over the current patterns of urban development that we have been seeing. When we talk about instruments, like, again, investment was mentioned, but investment can also come from other sources, like the role also of the private sector, maybe in helping with investment, not only on the shoulders of the municipalities and cities, and of course the policy instruments that actually make possible and make feasible this implementation in a large scale of urban nature. Yeah, I would say that those are the key points.
Thank you. And Maria Jose, particularly for the walking and cycling, I think what do you see as barriers and facilitators?
Okay, so picking up as well a little bit on the transition, what is the transition for urban mobility, for sustainable urban mobility in our case? Yes, active travel is important as well, but I also like to catch up on what was said before. So all the different modes also need their space in the city. So I would like to focus on public space. The space in cities is actually scarce and valuable. And actually, I think this is one of the key topics. All the modes are fighting for their space. So there must be, this respacing is a key aspect. There needs to be space for each of and all of the different modes. Some of the facilitators can be the increased awareness, the increased political commitment, that all things have been also mentioned already. Also the COVID-19 and the momentum that it has brought, I think it's something that we can capitalize on. And there are some barriers as well. We spoke previously about this resistance of certain groups to respacing the city in a fairer way and more balanced way. So maybe I can say that many cities are going through similar situations, and we even know this curve, no? So there's when you put in place a kind of measure that takes away space from cars, you have this high resistance sometimes in the first place, and then as the measure proves that it brings benefits to the citizens as a whole, then the resistance decreases and the acceptance increases. So I would say that I agree as well. So there are many best practices that we can look at. We can learn. Cities can learn from each other. Of course, each city has its specificity and its context is different. But I think that knowledge sharing is also very important in this regard.
Thank you. And you do a great job within the Polish network, and you have your conference each year to spread the knowledge and exactly, other activities. So it's great for that. Jana.
Yeah, well, what I've heard here today, I think a lot of this comes to showing the cost benefits of these solutions that are available and calculating the co-benefits, especially for the climate and human health. So hopefully we will see more research on the cost benefits of all these solutions that can then turn the policymakers' head to invest in these great possibilities.
Good. I think we need to wrap up, coming to the end. Jana, do you want to say any final words?
Well, on my behalf, I want to thank all our speakers today. Thank you for your wonderful presentations. And thank you, Mark, for co-chairing and leading the discussion. And I leave it to you to wrap up.
Yeah, thanks so much to everyone, the speakers. I think we've heard some great talks, the audience for the questions and also being here with us. That I believe it's a very important area. I think we've gone fairly broad. There are a lot of things happening in cities, and we've heard many of the important issues, I think. And I'm very much encouraged by the solutions that are being presented. There's a lot of activity. But we need to keep that energy going, I think. I'm a strong believer that we can make our cities more sustainable, more livable, and also healthier. And we need to put out this effort as a research community, as a policy community. Everyone is needed here. And I think, I don't know who actually is on the line here, but we need to work with all the different stakeholders involved. I mean, my own work, it's working a lot with urban planners, with transport planners, the education sector, and we need to reach out and bring everyone together, because only together we can come up with the right solutions that are also acceptable. So many thanks, everyone. Keep up all the good work, and looking forward to seeing you next week for the last one on the talks. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Cheers, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
So did we kick everyone out? Are there still some speakers left? Or?
I haven't figured it out.
Hi, are we still here?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity, and it was a very interesting talk today.
Me too. Cheers.
Thank you from me as well for a thought-provoking session. I enjoyed it a lot. Be well.
Thank you all.
Enjoy your afternoon walks.
Yep.
Great session.
Oh, Mark.